Hey guys, welcome to Arty Field Trips. I found this Crayola watercolor kit that I've had for a while, and I thought, in the spirit of the anti-haul, let's take a deep dive and find out if Crayola is really good for adults. Does it mix? Does it layer? How can you learn from it, or can you learn from it at all? The kit came with a lot of things, like this book of illustrations that had a blank sheet for swatching and a couple of exercises for blending and seeing if you can get a gradient. It came with the infamous Crayola brush that's way too limp for anything. We'll try it, but you'll see I'll switch to another one in a second. It came with these pans of paint that are your regular Crayola colors, and then some glitter colors, some pastel colors, and some iridescent colors. I also have these brushes from Michaels that I use all the time, and a white crayon for highlights, and a water brush to see if that works. I always use a tiny spray bottle to activate my paints, so we'll use that in a second. So let's get swatching. I'll swatch the regular Crayola colors first. And then right off the bat, I noticed they don't activate very well, and maybe it's this brush. When I get to the other brush in a minute, we'll see if it activates better. The pigment is just not coming off on the paper very well. It's very transparent. It's very light. These would make a good background for some journaling or a good overlay for a drawing in your sketchbook or something, so they're definitely useful for some stuff. The colors are bright and cute. They're not very dimensional. You can tell the pigment is like a dye-based, cheaper pigment. A lot of really good reds and yellows and oranges, which is going to come in handy later when we paint our sunflower. There's a good variety of colors. Even though all the pans are different types of colors that have similar shades, they do all come out different, so you have quite a collection of colors to choose from. As I get into the glitter colors though, you'll see that the glitter really doesn't show. And glitter doesn't show very well on videos anyway, but it didn't show very well in person either. So I kind of feel like the glitter was a waste. These, however, are sort of like a gel-like transparent color, so again, they'd be a really good background or overlay for some kind of other illustration in a fun sketchbook or a journal or something like that. Getting into the pastel colors, you can tell these are more opaque, which makes sense, but they're super chalky. And that's because in order to make a pastel watercolor, you have to add a white powder. And this being Crayola, we're not talking about expensive titanium that you would find in a more expensive watercolor. You're probably talking about some kind of talcum powder or something like that. And then we get into the iridescent ones, and these I find are the prettiest and the most effective at what they're supposed to do, because they definitely have a nice iridescent sheen to them. And the colors are really pretty without repeating another color in the set. And even though this set I don't think is sold by Crayola anymore, you can still get all these colors and all these types of paint from Crayola. Okay, so now that we have the swatches done, we'll set them aside, and I want to try what it's like to try to make a gradient with these. Gradients are good for background, they're good for shading and other types of artistic effects that you might want to make on your page. And this is where we're going to start to paint bigger spaces, and you're going to see how the dye in the paint stains the paper, even though we're trying to blend and we're trying to make a gradient. And that could make some interesting effects. I personally like to make a lot of urban looking art that looks kind of deconstructed and kind of stained anyway. So those could be useful in that way. But if you're trying to have control and trying to learn specific techniques, that's not very helpful, because this isn't the same as granulation that can happen with watercolors that you're trying to granulate on purpose. This is just a stain that you can't move or lift or blend or anything like that. All right, we're going to get into our flower. At the time of this narration, it's sort of the end of spring and the beginning of summer, so something light and bright like this will work. I know technically a sunflower is a fall flower, but I associate it with all of the warm months anyway. We're going to put these white highlights in with the white crayon uh, to see how that works. And then, so as we get started, I'm going to start with all my light layers first. And that's a tip I have for beginners with watercolor. Light to dark, walk in the park. Dark to light, you're in for a fight. And so you'll see it kind of all looks the same at first because the lightest color of the brown for the center and the orange for the leaves and the orange for the petals and the green for the leaves is yellow. So we have sort of a yellow based picture. But as we layer, you'll start to see the dimension and the contrast emerge, and we'll get a really nice looking flower with lots of depth and different areas that catch our eye. And as we get the first layer in, you can even start to see those white highlights from the crayon, and I'm already starting to be happy with that. I always forget about wax resist as like a legitimate technique. You do it in elementary school, but it's actually a technique to use in any kind of professional or anywhere in between level of art that you want to try. Okay, so we're still working with oranges. We're still looking about the same in the middle. But you'll see the middle will turn into a rich brown in just a second, because you have to layer the lightest values in a color first. And brown is kind of a yellow based color, so we have to start out with yellows and oranges, and then we'll get to brown in a second. Luckily, this set, like I said earlier, came with some pretty good oranges, a pretty good range of oranges. So we're going to get a nice, vibrant, layered petals. I kind of like how the crayon dots and stripes start to form a personality. They don't only create a value, they create a style within the piece as well. These colors are layering pretty well. I like to work you can let the layers dry completely, or you can work wet on wet. And I kind of like to work somewhere in between where I tightly control the amount of water on the page, but it's not completely dry, because I like to be able to blend out the edges of my layers well. If you were to let the layers dry all the way, it wouldn't be as easy to do that. We're starting to see more depth. These paints kind of layer a little bit more like ink than they do like paint, but I'm not mad at that. I kind of like that. I think they perform a lot better in layers as opposed to mixing them like in a palette or a mixing tray or something like that. So at this point, we're going to start to see more contrast. We're going to start to carve out the inner recesses. You can think of painting and adding shadows and the darker colors as sort of sculpting the surface of the paper. And as we're getting close to the end of our painting, my verdict about this is Crayola has something to offer. If you want to learn, or if you want a stress-free situation, if you're either like at home kind of recovering from an injury, but you still want to do something fun and worthwhile, these would work well for that. These would also work well if you were traveling and you just wanted something affordable to stick in your bag to take with you. These definitely have their uses. I had some preconceived ideas about how Crayola would work out, and they're pleasantly surprising me. as you can see, we're on like our fourth or fifth layer of color at this point, and we still have a few to go, as well as adding details and texture, and that's how you get a really rich image. The more layers and the more you can break down those colors into a spectrum of as many colors as you can possibly add, the more depth your picture's going to have, the more life it's going to have. I don't want to get too dark with this. Like I said, it's summertime. It's sort of the late spring, and we want to keep it nice and airy and bright. We're going to get some dots in the middle to get that texture going on. And here is a really good example of why I like to keep it a little bit wet on wet. Do you see the jarring difference between that dark and that light green? With the wet on wet, at least if it's a little bit wet, it's easier to bridge the gap between if you do that, if you accidentally add too much contrast. Here's those dots I was talking about. The texture elements are my favorite in any kind of drawing or painting. They're, I feel, what add to the personality of the painting. Like, no one's going to put the lines in the creases of the petals like you. No one's going to put those dots in the center like you are. So as we get to the end of our picture, I want to thank you for joining me on Arty Field Trips. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. And here's our final picture. Thank you, guys.